In a bustling African town filled with life, laughter, and the rhythm of everyday struggles, there lived a respected businessman whose name carried honor, trust, and dignity in the community. He was a man of great influence, known for his fairness, generosity, and wisdom, and people often turned to him for guidance in matters of family and trade. But one fateful day, the entire town was struck by a heavy blow when this man suddenly fell ill and passed away, leaving his household covered in grief and his legacy hanging in uncertainty. Behind him, he left not only his wealth and the memory of his kindness, but also his 3 little triplets, innocent children with wide, wondering eyes who barely understood what had happened to their beloved father. They were fragile, clinging to each other for comfort, not knowing that their lives were about to be shattered in ways even worse than losing their father. Their mother had long been gone, and the only guardian left was their stepmother, the woman their father had married in hopes of giving them love and care. But instead of kindness, she carried bitterness in her heart, and instead of protection, she was driven by greed, anger, and resentment. The moment their father was buried, whispers of property and inheritance filled the air, and the stepmother's eyes no longer looked at the children with even the faintest hint of compassion. She saw them as nothing more than obstacles, 3 mouths she did not wish to feed, 3 lives that stood between her and the full control of their father's estate. With a cold heart and no regard for the pain of 3 grieving children, she made a decision that shocked even those who lived around her. Instead of sheltering them, instead of keeping the promise of motherhood that marriage had placed upon her shoulders, she threw the triplets out of the house. Standing in the courtyard, her voice sharp and bitter, she told them they were a burden, unwanted, undeserving of the comfort of the home their father had built. The children, too young to fight back and too broken to understand, could only hold one another's hands as they were pushed away from the only safety they had ever known. The neighbors saw. Some stood at their doors, whispering in disbelief. Others shook their heads with quiet sorrow, and a few even thought of helping. But the stepmother's power, her influence, and her sharp tongue were feared by many. Nobody dared to confront her openly, for in that town her voice carried authority and her reach stretched wide. So, while hearts ached, no one stepped forward to shield the innocent. The triplets, fragile and confused, were left to the mercy of fate. It was a night when the clouds gathered heavy in the sky, and the heavens seemed to mourn with them. Rain poured down, soaking their small clothes as thunder echoed across the town. The children walked barefoot on the muddy path, the cold earth clinging to their tiny feet, their trembling hands clutching one another tightly, as if their very lives depended on never letting go. Their eyes were full of tears, but they did not cry out, for they knew no one would answer. They walked together into the darkness, 3 little souls against the world, vanishing slowly into the night. The town went quiet after that. The stepmother closed her doors, content in her cruelty, while the neighbors carried the story in hushed voices, repeating it with pity, but never with courage. People wondered where the children had gone, whether they had survived, or whether the rain that swallowed them that night had washed them away forever. Some said they would never return, that their fragile lives would be lost to the hardships of the road. Others believed destiny would protect them, though no one dared to say it aloud. Years passed, and the memory of the triplets faded like a distant wound, still painful, but buried under the dust of time. And yet, fate writes stories beyond human imagination. For what seemed like an ending was not the end at all. Those who thought the triplets would never return could not have been more wrong. Destiny was quietly shaping them, carving them into something greater, preparing them for a moment that would one day shake the very ground of that town. The night they disappeared barefoot in the rain was not the night they were lost. It was the night their true journey began. Everyone thought they would never return, but fate had other plans. In the years that followed their painful departure, the triplets found themselves separated by fate, each carried into different corners of the land, each forced to survive in a world that offered them nothing but hardship. In distant African villages, far from the home they once knew, they grew up facing the sharp cruelty of life without the warmth of family to protect them. Hunger became their constant shadow, a pain that gnawed at their small bodies and forced them to learn resilience before their time. Some days they would go without food, surviving only on water, roots, or the kindness of strangers who offered them scraps. Other days they were bullied for being outsiders, children without a father, without a name, mocked as orphans who belonged nowhere. The harshness of life pressed down on them like an unrelenting storm, shaping their hearts, their minds, and their destinies in ways no one could yet understand. And yet, within each of them burned a small flame, faint but unextinguishable. It was the memory of their father's words, words he had spoken with warmth and wisdom while he was still alive. Family is strength, honor is protection. Justice will always find its way. These words echoed in their hearts through every trial, carrying them forward when their bodies felt too weak to take another step. Though they were separated, though they grew up in different villages with different lives, the bond of blood and the weight of their father's memory bound them together even from afar. Each child, without knowing, was walking a different path that would one day return to the same destiny. The first triplet, with a quiet but relentless spirit, found refuge in learning. Though mocked for his poverty and ragged clothes, he discovered a gift for books, numbers, and wisdom. Every page he studied was like a door opening to a brighter future, and he poured himself into his studies with a hunger greater than any hunger for food. He became a brilliant scholar, admired even by elders and teachers, rising from the dust of abandonment to the heights of intellect. The second triplet, fiery in nature, refused to bow to the cruelty of life. He began trading small goods in the market, starting with nothing but determination. He faced rejection, insults, and betrayal, but his courage never wavered. He learned to take risks, to fight for survival, and to turn every setback into an opportunity. With each year, he grew into a fearless entrepreneur, one whose sharp mind and bold decisions would one day make him a force to reckon with. The third triplet, soft-hearted yet strong in spirit, was drawn to the suffering of those around him. He could not look away when children cried in hunger or when elders struggled in silence. Though he himself had little, he shared whatever he could. Over time, people began to look to him for guidance, for comfort, for hope. He became a kind-hearted leader among the poor, not through power or wealth, but through compassion and the strength of his character. Together, though apart, they became three very different individuals, one of the mind, one of courage, and one of the heart. None of them knew what fate was preparing, but all of them carried in their souls the unshakable weight of the injustice done to them as children. Meanwhile, back in the town they once called home, the stepmother's life took a very different shape. With the children gone, no one stood between her and her late husband's estate. She grew richer year after year, expanding her wealth, building her influence, and gaining the respect of those who valued gold more than truth. She wore fine clothes, dined at rich tables, and raised her voice high in laughter at gatherings. Yet behind the smile, there was mockery of the memory of the triplets she had cast aside. She told herself they were gone forever, swallowed by poverty, erased by the harshness of life. To her, they were nothing but a forgotten chapter, a story with no return. She believed her cruelty had triumphed, that fate itself had buried those children in silence. But what she did not know, what she could never imagine, was that destiny was quietly preparing a storm. For every book the scholar read, for every trade the entrepreneur mastered, for every hand the leader lifted in kindness, the day of reckoning drew nearer. And when it came, it would shake not just her wealth, but the very foundations of her pride. It had been 20 long years since that rainy night when the triplets vanished into the darkness. The town had changed in those 2 decades. New buildings had risen, markets had grown busier, and faces once young were now lined with age. Yet, beneath the surface, whispers of the old story remained. Some remembered the children who had been thrown out. Others had buried the memory deep within themselves, but no one ever truly expected to see them again. Life, it seemed, had moved forward, leaving the past behind. That is why the arrival of three mysterious wealthy figures stirred such curiosity, for they did not come like ordinary travelers. They came with quiet dignity, their presence commanding respect even before their names were known. The three figures did not announce who they were, nor did they boast of their wealth. Instead, their actions spoke louder than any words. They gave generously to the local church and mosque, repairing walls that had long been crumbling, restoring roofs that had leaked during storms, and placing food in the hands of widows and orphans who had gone hungry for too long. They walked among the poor, offering kindness without arrogance, speaking gently to the elders and lifting the spirits of the children. Their generosity spread like fire across the town, and soon everyone was talking about them. Some said they were royalty from a faraway land. Others believed they were messengers of destiny, men touched by God's hand. But no one truly knew. What they did know, however, was that their arrival was a blessing. The townspeople admired them, and their names carried a sense of awe and mystery. Even those who had long forgotten the story of the triplets found themselves whispering with curiosity, wondering who these men really were and why they had chosen to bless their community. Their faces, though unfamiliar, seemed strangely haunting, as if the shadows of the past lingered in their eyes, but no one dared to ask directly. Respect, and perhaps a touch of fear, kept the questions locked behind sealed lips. Then came the day of the grand town gathering, a celebration where the wealthiest, the proudest, and the most influential stood side by side with the common people. The air was filled with music and laughter, drums beating in rhythm, voices raised in song. And there, in the very heart of the gathering, stood the stepmother herself. Dressed in her finest clothes, heavy with jewelry, her chin lifted high, she moved through the crowd with the same arrogance she had carried for decades. She had grown older, but her pride was untouched. She smiled as people bowed to her, spoke with authority as if she owned not only her late husband's estate, but the very respect of the town itself. For years, she had believed the past was buried, and that belief gave her confidence, a false shield of security. But that night, destiny was waiting. The three strangers entered the gathering, their presence silencing the crowd. Conversations fell quiet, eyes turned and hearts beat faster as the wealthy figures moved with calm assurance. They stepped forward, their gaze steady, their shoulders strong. The music softened, and even the laughter faded, replaced by an air of expectation no one could explain. Then, with a single glance exchanged between them, the moment came. They revealed themselves. They were not princes from a foreign land, nor nameless benefactors with no ties to the people. They were the very children who had been thrown into the night, the triplets who had once walked barefoot in the rain, clutching each other's hands for survival. Their voices rang out, firm and unshaken, as they declared the truth. Gasps erupted across the gathering. Mothers pressed their hands to their mouths in disbelief. Elders shook their heads with tears streaming down their faces, and the crowd swayed as the weight of the revelation struck like thunder. Some cried openly, others shouted praises, calling their return a miracle. And then all eyes turned to the stepmother. Her proud face suddenly drained of all color. Her hands trembled, her lips quivered, and for the first time in many years, her voice failed her. She had mocked their memory for 20 years, convinced they were gone forever. Now they stood before her, stronger than she had ever imagined. The moment of truth had arrived, and the air in the town gathering grew heavy with silence. All eyes were fixed on the three figures, standing tall before the woman who had once thrown them out into the night. The triplets, no longer frail children, but strong men shaped by years of struggle, carried themselves with dignity and power. The crowd waited, breath held, as the confrontation everyone had never imagined possible unfolded before their eyes. With voices steady and firm, they spoke the words that cut through the night like a blade. "When you threw us out, we had nothing. Today, we return with everything." The words struck the air with such force that people gasped, and some even clutched their chests. For 20 years, the stepmother had lived in the shadow of her cruelty, but now the truth stood face to face with her, alive and unshakable. The stepmother's proud mask cracked instantly. She staggered back, her eyes darting across the crowd as if searching for an escape, as if the faces around her might rescue her from the weight of her own sins. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, broke into stammers. She tried to beg, her tone shifting from arrogance to desperation. "I was young, I was frightened, I did not know better," she cried, twisting her words, trying to paint her cruelty as a mistake of circumstance. She reached for pity, blaming the past, blaming grief, blaming anyone but herself. She wanted the crowd to believe that she had been a victim of life, that her decision to cast out the triplets had been an act of weakness, not of malice. But the eyes that watched her no longer held fear. The spell of her power was broken. The triplets stood firm, unmoved by her excuses. Their faces carried not only strength, but the deep scars of memory. They did not need to shout. Their very presence was proof of her betrayal and their survival. The people of the town, who had once stayed silent when the children were thrown into the rain, now found their voices rising. One by one, testimonies poured out. An elder stepped forward, his voice trembling with regret, confessing how he had watched the children walk barefoot into the storm and done nothing. A woman cried openly as she admitted she had wanted to help, but had been too afraid of the stepmother's wrath. Murmurs swelled into shouts, and soon the whole gathering was alive with voices accusing her, condemning her cruelty, and exposing the years of fear that had kept them quiet. The stepmother's shoulders hunched as the weight of truth pressed down on her. For years, she had walked through the town with her head high, basking in respect, wearing wealth like a crown. Now, in a single night, her crown crumbled into dust. The very people who once bowed to her now turned their backs. The respect she had clung to slipped from her grasp, vanishing faster than she could beg for it. The influence she had built brick by brick over decades began to collapse like a fragile wall struck by a storm. Even the estate she had so proudly expanded now felt unsteady beneath her, as if it too rejected her claim. The triplets did not raise their hands against her, nor did they need to. Justice had arrived, not in violence, but in truth. The people who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke freely, and their voices carried more weight than her desperate cries. She had mocked the memory of the children for years, but now their living presence stood as proof that fate cannot be silenced. Her downfall had begun, and nothing could stop it. The audience at the gathering was left in shock. Some wept at the power of justice unfolding before them, others whispered prayers of gratitude, and many simply stood frozen, unable to believe they were witnessing the fall of a woman who had once seemed untouchable. The night that had begun in celebration was now etched into history as the night arrogance was humbled and cruelty was stripped bare before the eyes of all. The stepmother, once feared, was now nothing more than a trembling figure surrounded by the echoes of her sins. The night of confrontation gave way to a new dawn, one that carried with it the weight of justice and the promise of renewal. The triplets, no longer the helpless children who had once been cast into the rain, stood now as men of strength, wisdom, and purpose. They reclaimed their father's estate, but not with the cruelty of vengeance nor with the bitterness of anger. Instead, they carried within them the lessons carved by years of hardship. They knew what it meant to hunger, to feel pain, to to face rejection, and to walk barefoot in storms with no hand to guide them. Because of that, they understood that true victory was not in destroying their stepmother, but in healing the community and fulfilling the dream their father had once held in his heart. With steady hands and united spirits, they began to rebuild. Where there had been silence, they created schools so that children would never again be denied knowledge, no matter how poor they were. Where there had been sickness and neglect, they built hospitals, offering care to the weak, the elderly, and the forgotten. Where poverty had crushed hope, they opened businesses, creating jobs, opportunities, and dignity for those who had long lived in struggle. The estate, once a symbol of selfishness and greed, became a source of blessing for all. People from across the region traveled to witness the transformation, speaking with admiration of the three brothers who had returned not as broken souls, but as heroes of the people. Their generosity and leadership lit a fire of hope. Parents blessed them, elders praised them, and children ran to them with laughter in their eyes. They were not just heirs of their father's wealth, they had become guardians of his legacy. Every act of kindness, every hand they lifted, every life they touched was a testimony that the seeds of suffering could blossom into a harvest of greatness when watered with resilience and faith. Meanwhile, the stepmother, once the most feared woman in the town, now walked in silence and disgrace. The jewels she had worn so proudly felt heavy with shame. The respect she had once demanded had vanished, and the people who once bowed to her now turned their faces away. She wandered alone, her footsteps carrying her farther from the estate she had stolen, farther from the pride she had clung to, and deeper into the weight of her regret. Tears stained her face as she realized the truth. Cruelty may win for a moment, but kindness always triumphs in the end. The children she had abandoned were now greater than she could have ever imagined, and the wealth she had guarded with selfish hands was now used for the good of the very community she had ignored. Her life, once filled with arrogance, was now nothing more than a shadow of loss. But the story did not end in her tears. It ended in the triumph of the triplets, who stood together at the heart of the estate that was once their father's. Hand in hand, they looked out over the land, their eyes filled not with bitterness, but with fulfillment. The winds carried the voices of the people praising them, the sound of children learning in new schools, the laughter of families finding hope, and the prayers of the sick being healed in hospitals built from their strength. It was more than wealth. It was legacy. It was the dream of their father living on through them. As the sun set over the land, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, the image of the three brothers standing united became a symbol greater than any crown or throne. They had endured betrayal, survived suffering, and overcome despair, not to destroy, but to build. And in that moment, destiny itself bowed to them, for they had chosen the higher path, the path of honor and compassion. The story closed with words that echoed across the hearts of all who heard it. When you plant evil, it grows into shame. But when you plant kindness, it grows into a legacy.